Alum, namaste. It's nighttime here. And tonight, I want to talk about how a child sees corruption of spirit. How a child sees the training and compromise that it receives in communal society. Now, I'm speaking especially to to children in the West, I think, because in the West, this sickness is much thicker. I can look in the eyes of a young girl in India and see real purity of spirit, whereas in this country, by the time a child is 5, they've seen so many compromises. And I'm talking about ordinary people here. I'm not talking about bad people. I'm talking about how ordinary people get sucked into making compromises, and the compromises are always complicit with something that is not to the general good. And unfortunately, these compromises grow and grow and grow. So, I'm going to tell a story about a man. He wasn't a bad man. In fact, he had a very good heart. He was very gentle with animals. And children especially loved him because he had the ability to be a child. He told great stories and all of those things. So please remember all the wonderful things about the man. The man was my adopted father, not my real father. I'll tell you that story another day. But this man was my adopted father, and he was a very important man in his community. He was a teacher. He had been a teacher, but he had become the elementary supervisor, which means the principal over all the schools of a large, pretty wealthy school district in New York State. So he was an important man, and he became more important as the years went by. He was instrumental in building 2 more schools. So he was in charge of actually 4 schools. All of the elementary school children went to these schools. So he was a very important man. Now, the problem is that, okay, now when I was first adopted, I was about 3. We went to church. Our church was a Methodist church, and we went every Sunday. All of my growing up life, we went to church every Sunday. And he read us the Bible during the week. And so I especially loved the Gospels. By the time I was about maybe 8 years old, I had most of the Gospels memorized. And I really believed that we had to do those things. We had to do them. There was no making excuses for it. They were things that that the master teacher, told us to do. So in my child's eyes, I was like totally pure in the heart of God, and believed that people would try to do what the teaching said. As time went on, I became aware that this was not even the norm, that most people were so wrapped up in what they wanted to get from life in terms of position, in terms of money, in terms of having a nice house, in terms of all of the things, all of the material things, that they didn't even make an attempt to do anything except lip service to the teachings. So this disturbed me a lot. But I also didn't see that there was an awful lot I could do about it. Well, as time went on, when I got to be about 8 years old especially, I started to really question why nobody in church or any place else was, I don't know. I don't understand it to this day. The cruelty that a child suffers watching the adults profess to believe in something beautiful, something so beautiful, and defiling it at every step of the way. The house where I lived, the woman, the wife of this principal of schools, shepherd of children, was extremely abusive. There was never a day that went by that we were berated and beaten, and it was pretty horrible. I understood at a very young age that this was a sickness in her, and I knew her mother, and so I know that the abuse that this woman was pouring out of her from every pore had been visited upon her. This made it somewhat easier to bear, because you see, I believed even at a very young age that love had to conquer. That if you were angry and you hated, that was just like drinking poison. That was basically what she did. She was angry and she hated. And so she became the very image that she hated so much. That's a very tragic result for a child. My mother, my adopted mother, who was such an abuser, she actually committed incest with her own son, and he ended up committing suicide. But all of this was a sickness that came from her family. It was passed down. It not so much a karmic thing as it simply is the sickness is passed down. The anger, the unresolved anger is passed down from generation to generation, from child to child. When you have understanding for what that pain is, then it becomes easier to let it go and really genuinely love the injured soul that is there. This is the way we love our enemies, and Christ said that we had to love our enemies, not just our friends, not just the people we agree with, but we have to really in our hearts not have any hatred or anger for anybody. And I knew that when I was 6 years old. When I was about 8 years old, I started getting my Easter basket out, and on the 1st of May, I made my own holiday. I would sneak out of the house at dawn, and I'd fill it with wildflowers from the swamp. And then I'd leave it on the doorstep and sneak back to my bed. Because you see, if I gave a gift of love to this poor soul who was so angry and so sad that she was hurting everybody around her all of the time, and I gave it to her in secret, so I wasn't garnering any favor by the gift. That's a gift between me and God, and those gifts are always answered. When we give totally from the love of ourselves, especially to somebody who has caused us much pain and hurt, when we do that, it releases the bonds of that pain inside of us, and it makes our soul rejoice. I knew these things when I was younger, but I constantly was seeing. Okay, now my father, for example, as his school empire grew and he was more and more important, his reputation became more important to him than even the good of his own children and the good of other people's children, as it turned out. An example of this is when I was in 6th grade, there were 2 male teachers hired. One was Mr. Lennon, who was my teacher, and the other one was Mr. Russell. Mr. Russell liked little boys, and he started taking all of his little boys on camping trips and crawling in their sleeping bags with them, etc. Well, this became known to my father. Parents complained, and my father's decision was that this was just going to be too controversial, and he didn't want his reputation to be sullied by such horrible behavior. So rather than having Mr. Russell arrested, my father gave him a reference. He let him resign with a reference. So Mr. Russell went on. I kind of followed it. I was a pretty smart 6th grader. I kind of followed it. He went on to abuse children in 2 more schools before finally one school had the moral fortitude to stand up and have the man arrested. How many children were hurt by those compromises? See, we make those compromises all the time. This was not some unusual event or something. It just was maybe a little more egregious than some, but, in corporations, in our work life, I just had it happen to me in hospice care. Everybody knew a policy was wrong, and everybody refused to stand up and have something done about it. I had a hospice chaplain when I went off from hospice just recently. He decided his job was more important. He couldn't even continue giving me communion. How does that figure in with the gospel teaching? And what kind of lessons do we teach children when these are the compromises that they see every day? When I was growing up, and all the way through my life, really, I haven't seen any change here at all. Very seldom have I seen anybody stand up for the right on this planet. One time I was taking care of a group of mentally ill people who were in group homes, and they had a program that went on at a local Catholic church, and it started at 6:30. Well, the group home people would drop the people off at the door of the church an hour sooner because it gave them more time off. It was an hour, an extra hour for their dinner hour. Well, it was a blazing snowstorm, and there were about 40 disabled adults standing outside the church door at 5:30 at night, and even though the people were in the church, they refused to let the people in until 6:30, even though the weather was absolutely horrible. So I stood outside with these 50 or so adults, many of them elderly. One of them didn't have a jacket at all. I gave him my jacket. And I have to say that after I gave him the jacket, I was warm as toast for the whole rest of the time that I was standing there. Because that's how God works. When you give fully of everything you have, then God gives fully of everything He has. It's a flow. It's a bountiful flow. But I stood on the street and it's empty church building, heated, warm. They couldn't go in there and just sit in the pews. All of these things tell a child something. A child sees these things, and the child's soul hardens. And innocence is lost very quickly. Very quickly. I was extremely, extremely fortunate because I had a very, very, very close bond with Jesus from before I ever came here. But children, they learn what they live. And when you make a compromise with something that's wrong at work, and everybody knows it's wrong, but you just don't want to do anything about it, well, the wrong gets bigger all the time. More and more people get hurt by that wrong all the time. And also your own soul hardens. Every time you make those decisions, your own soul hardens, and it becomes easier and easier and easier to make more and more and more compromises until there is no light left. If you value the light, you have to stand for it. Otherwise, it dies inside of you. Anyway, that's my sad story for today. And there'll probably be more of this because people need to hear it. We need to wake up. How many children have to die? We got children in concentration camps on our border right now. What is anybody doing about it? Nothing? What can we do? We can certainly do something. We can enliven our church families to go out there and actually be Christians. Because they're supposed to know we are Christians by our love. And there's been precious little of that. Self-interest. It's all self-interest. Wake up. The planet is dying. Our children, our grandchildren are going to have very little future if things continue the way they are. Anyway, peace be with all of you. Try to make peaceful choices in your life. I don't watch anything that's not peaceful. I don't read anything that's not peaceful. And be grateful. Be grateful for what you have. And try to share what you have with the rest of the world because we are all one soul in the one great soul. Amen.